In this video, I'm going to teach you the English words and phrases that you need to talk about your routine. These are very common phrases, and once you know them, you know them. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Let's get started. So let's get into some phrases that we can use to talk about routines, things we do in a typical day. And we're going to break it into three general categories. The first category is going to be time, and then we're going to talk about frequency, how we can use frequency words when we're giving, let's say, parts of our routine, and then we'll talk about conditionals. And conditionals are if statements, basically, right? And really, it's a matter of knowing how to connect all these together to make a complete routine. That is the challenge. Once you get comfortable with the phrases, it's actually not that hard. So let's start with time. I'm just going to give some examples, but I want to be clear that there are a billion different things that we could say here for each of these. I'm just giving you a sense for these, and I want you to start thinking about how to build them out. But you may notice some common patterns in the way that these are structured, okay? And then at the end, we're going to look at a complete example. Okay, so around 9 o'clock, this is where you would talk about time, but you don't want to be too specific, right? Around, that could be before, that could be after. It's not very specific, and that can be useful because sometimes it is before or after, right? Can you say at around 9? Yes, that's okay. So if you want to say at around 9 instead of just around 9, that's totally fine. Now, sometimes it is very clearly before or after. So before hitting the gym, I have a smoothie, right? After hitting the gym. So if you know, if it's a sequence of things, then you probably want to use before or after this event. So yes, it is not exactly a time, but it is around an event, and so we can use time there. On days when I work from home, this is where we have a thing that may or may not happen, right? Now, we could phrase that as a conditional, which we're going to look at in a moment. But if we want to just say, on days when I work from home, on days that, it's raining outside, something like that, then we say that happens and that happens. We can put those together in the same way that we use if. On days when I work from home, what do you do, right? Or as soon as I get home. This is very quickly after. It's basically as it's happening. We could say simultaneous, right? As soon as I get home, as soon as I walk in the door. That's like saying the moment that thing happens. And then you connect that action. So for all of these, we're talking about when things happen, basically, connecting them in time to either other things or times. For around 9 o'clock, that's a time. Before hitting the gym, that's an event or a thing that I do. On days when I work from home, that's connected to something I may do. As soon as I get home, that is connected to a thing that I do, okay? Now let's talk about using frequency words. These are words like sometimes, always, never, usually, typically, right? So let's talk about how we could use these. And it's very similar, right? It's very similar. We can add it or remove it either way. Typically, before my evening walk. I could say before my evening walk, and that's exactly like the examples we just looked at. Typically, before my evening walk. What is that changing? All it's doing is saying that it may not always be that way, but let's say, 85% of the time it is that way. That's just an example percentage, but it's like saying if you were to count up the number of times that I go on a walk, right, then of those times, 85%, I'm going to do this. I'm going to What do you do? Check my email, some activity, right? Sometimes would be then the opposite, would be not as often, maybe only 20%. And again, I'm just giving a rough idea. Sometimes would be less often than typically. Sometimes once I'm done, right? So maybe that's a treat. Sometimes once I'm done, I'll have a slice of cake. If I say typically once I'm done, I'll have a slice of cake, that's very different, right? That means I'm eating a lot of cake. Sometimes maybe I do that as a treat. And normally is the same as typically. It's basically the same thing. If you want to put words in there like almost always or most of the time or rarely or every so often, I mean, there are a lot of phrases that you can use there to talk about frequency. Normally maybe has a different emphasis than typically. So normally right before bed, normally may slightly emphasize more that if everything goes according to plan, this happens. And sometimes something doesn't go according to plan, and so then it doesn't happen, right? That may be the emphasis of normally, but you could use typically for that as well. Okay. Now let's talk about a conditional. A conditional is usually when we're using an if statement or perhaps sometimes when to state this thing happening and then another thing happening, and it may or may not happen, right? So if I skip breakfast, this is not really telling me how often I skip breakfast, but it is saying that when breakfast is skipped, and we often use when too, then another thing happens. It's connecting it to another thing. But if that other thing doesn't happen, then this doesn't happen. So if I skip breakfast, I have a coffee and then go to work, right? So that's what I have. So if I don't skip breakfast, maybe I do something else, right? It's just an example. When there's no traffic, so when there is traffic and when there's no traffic, generally will be two different things. So when there's no traffic, I drive to work. But when there's very bad traffic, I generally take the subway. So the state of the traffic determines what I will do as part of my routine. You need that kind of flexibility when you're talking about your routine, because if you don't have it, then it's not very realistic, because your life is not going to ever be 100% always, right? Sometimes you do things, and typically you do other things. And sometimes things happen, and if they happen, what do you do? And if they don't happen, what do you do? And when they happen, what happens after that, right? So we need these phrases to be able to actually realistically describe our routine. So if it's raining outside, I may skip my morning run. Okay. Now, you could say something like, I always go for a morning run unless it's raining outside. So that is to say, normally I go for a morning run. There may be one thing that can cancel that if it's raining. Okay, so you can say it either way. You could say, unless it's raining, I go for a run every day. Okay, or if it's raining, I don't go for my morning run. If you say if there, then you're trying to focus on the thing that does not happen, which means that normally it does happen. That might sound a little bit complicated, but actually it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple. So let's read through this and sort of understand it all in context. And I'm going to look down to read it. Around 9 o'clock, I start my day with some light stretching and meditation. I want to be very clear. This is not real. This is not my routine. Okay. I want to be very clear. This is not my routine. I do not start the day with stretching and meditation. Although I do start the day with meditation, but I don't hit the gym. So, well, I do sometimes. Okay. Around 9 o'clock, I start my day with some light stretching. Before hitting the gym, I have a protein shake to give me an energy boost. However, if I skip breakfast, I make sure to have a bigger lunch later on. When there's no traffic, it usually takes me only 15 minutes to get to work. And again, there you could say, when there's no traffic, I take the subway. You could say your action, or something that usually is true when something else is true, right? So where was I? Oh, yes. And on days when I work from home, I generally take a short nap in the afternoon. Generally is sort of like usually. Yeah, it's pretty much like usually. As soon as I get home, I light a candle and make a cup of coffee. Not true for me, by the way. Light a candle. Typically, before my evening walk, I spend some time catching up on the news. Definitely not me. I don't really watch the news. Sometimes, once I'm done with the housework, I like to unwind with some music or call a friend. Definitely not me. I hate talking on the phone. If it's raining outside, I cozy up with a hot cup of cocoa and read a book. Yeah, I do that sometimes without the cocoa, usually tea instead. Normally, right before bed, I spend some time reading or journaling. Reading, yes. Journaling, not so much. So this is just an example of how we could put these together. I broke these down into 3 types just to give you some separation, how we can talk about time relating events together, for example, right? Around 9 o'clock, right? And as soon as I get home, we're trying to connect events together in time, right? We talked about how we can use words of frequency, usually, typically, normally, sometimes, or all of those words, which I'm sure you know, can be inserted in there to give some flavor to how often you do things, how normal your activities are. And then using conditionals to give some flexibility to your routine so that when you're talking about stuff that you do, it's clear that some things are connected to other things. And if that thing doesn't happen, then the other thing doesn't happen. Or if that thing happens, then another thing does happen, or whatever, right? There's a lot of flexibility that you can add to a description of something that you do when you use a conditional. So practice these. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and also get a free course in the links in the description.